I have the pleasure to introduce our first keynote today by Christine Vogt-William, Dr. Christine Vogt-William, who is currently the Director of Gender and Diversity in the Africa Multiple Cluster. So the cluster itself has an office, and Christine is the director of this office. But Christine is also a scholar of literature and of cultural studies, and she's speaking in this double capacity today on the topic of care and intersectional responsibility in times of COVID-19. And when you take the notion of times in the title of her talk, the current times cannot only be reduced to COVID-19. The contemporary moment is a product of many threads, of multiple articulations of this larger system in which we are all embedded, globalized capitalism, and COVID-19 has only been the tipping of these multiple developments to which Christine today will speak. Originally, she is from Singapore. She then studied English and German and psychology at the University of Essen in Germany. She then completed a doctoral thesis at the Center of Women's Studies at the University of York in England as a Marie Curie Gender Graduate Fellow. She has also authored a monograph called Bridges, Borders and Bodies, Transgressive Transculturality in Contemporary South Asian and Diasporic Women's Novels, and co-edited essay collection, which is very interesting, called Disturbing Bodies. So from this, you can already see an interest in diasporic life worlds, in bodies, and especially representations of bodies, deviant bodies. She has also published on queer and critical race approaches to Tolkien's work, classics in literature, but also to literary representations of transracial adoption and transnational surrogacy in postcolonial women's writings. Besides a number of other merits, I won't repeat her. She has really had an international career. She was a visiting scholar at Emory University in Atlanta, which is very famous for their departments of women's studies. And she has also been to various other German universities. And I only would like to highlight one prominent post she had there. From 2014 to 17, she was interim professor of postcolonial and gender studies at the English and American Studies Department at Humboldt University. And after that, we are happy to have you here in Bayreuth, Christine. And for 1 year now, I've been working with you. Many others have been working with you. And I think we all learned a lot from your work, from your politics, and from your professional praxis. So thank you very much, Christine Vogt-William. Welcome.
Thank you, Stefan, for your kind introduction. And thank you for having me, Susan, Katharina, and the organization team of the Digital Literature Festival here at the University of Bayreuth. All this is designed to accommodate the current situation, and it is good to connect, albeit virtually. I'm going to try and share my screen with you so that we can get started on the conversations. We are living in strange times, and it is not just COVID-19 times that I'm talking about. The conundrum of this time is that we are required to practice social distancing. We are required to keep our distance to those we love, to those we work with, distance to even those we do not know in public spaces, in order to exercise care towards them, care towards ourselves, to keep them and ourselves safe. This time of the COVID-19 novovirus allows us then to revisit the notion of care. What is meant by care? How is care significant to our work as artists, administrators, educators, researchers, indeed workers of all walks of life? as citizens? How do the aspects of care inform relationalities in research and art? Could research be a mode of care? Could it take place in frameworks of care politics? Is art a form of care politics? How could art express care? How do we do care? There are two forms of this little word that preoccupy me. One, caring, is a doing word, a verb that brings us actively into relationalities that require us to take responsibility for ourselves and for each other, where we care for each other and we are cared for. Care as a noun, to encompass the action of giving and receiving care. Care as service, as commodity, as policy, as politics. Care as tangible proof that someone, somewhere, somehow has exercised caring, has done care work, has provided care. In my attempts to look at the concept of care, it is imperative to note that care involves an ethical understanding of responsibility and relationality. Riffing off her seminal 1993 work, Moral Boundaries, a political argument for an ethics of care, Joan Tronto made the claim that the world would look very different if we put care at the center of our political lives. Tronto proposes in her 2013 work, Caring Democracy, to think about caring in its broadest and most public form, as a way in which a society allocates responsibilities and mobilizes genuine concern amongst citizens. Whoops, it's not moving, sorry, yeah. I have recourse to Joan Tronto's bringing together these ideas in her reading of care through a political lens, setting up care as a mode of citizen responsibility, where she points out, what has happened to our concerns about care? Why has the language of economics seemingly come to replace all other forms of political language? Here is the place where the little word care takes up another burden. What has gone wrong is that we have lost sight of the other side of human existence besides the world of the economy. In addition to our economic roles as workers and consumers, citizens live in two other realms as well. The world of intimate caring in our households, families, and circles of friends, and in the political world. Interestingly, Tronto points out the masculinized economic nexus of power informing current political language, which conceives of citizens as workers and consumers, foregrounding economic aspects of life. At the same time, she emphasizes the politics of care as shaping the intersections of familial and communal relations within greater political contexts. And I think we can see this happening right now in the context of COVID-19. Tronto's, sorry, this was wrong. Okay, we missed a slide. Tronto's further ruminations show us how politics itself is a mode of caring. Politics has historically been and rightfully should be closer to something we think of as part of our households, a realm of caring. Both are kinds of institutions that rely upon bonds other than those that arise when people pursue their self-interest. In a democracy, politics requires our care, and we should expect from the state a certain kind of support for all of our caring practices. Government is something we care about and something that reciprocates by providing care for us as well. So with global attention being directed towards how the pandemic has left its deadly traces of havoc in different countries, slamming the brakes on our daily activities, affecting our relationships to people, spaces, objects, what becomes apparent then are the structural inequalities that have often been ignored, dismissed, or erased by those in power. The question of power is eminently present in our understandings of care politics concerning medical care and the confrontation of the pandemic. Indeed, those in power are being measured now against their responses to the pandemic and the mode of leadership they demonstrate, the level of care they profess and provide to deal with in the crisis in ways to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we can live in it in the best way possible. So care politics also contains an ethical dimension which recognizes that people exist in mutual, interconnected, interdependent, and unequal relations with each other. Care ethics compels us to recognize that people have to find ways to deal with our vulnerabilities, our dependencies in our daily lives, guided by our individual and collective value systems. Hence, conceptualized, care ethics implicitly or explicitly involves issues of power, cultural, and social production. Care is thus no longer a notion tethered to the home space, the domestic sphere, a gendered site where women are meant to carry the responsibility for caring for the family through mothering and nurturing activities. Instead, the political dimension of care entails the recognition of humans as concrete beings existing in mutually interconnected and unequal relations with each other. The complexity of human positionality and relational webs are thus entrenched in the hierarchical orderings of any social category informed by power relations. Contingent on this understanding, I turn to Olena Hankivski's 2004 project of bringing care ethics in conversation with the theoretical paradigm of intersectionality, which offers a robust method for understanding the significance of intersections of difference and their relationship to power. Intersectionality theory, working through the paradigm of care politics, has the potential to navigate and negotiate how vulnerability and dependency are linked to care, whereby power hierarchies are invested with modes of caring or carelessness. The examples I address in the following bear some reflection and scrutiny in line with Toronto's and Hankivski's readings of care here as political work that we should do as citizens. Hence, the time of the Covid-19 and the contingent moment of Black Lives Matter bears some reflection with regard to the idea of care, in that we rethink how we use our time, energy, work, knowledge, and material resources to make certain that we, as well as those around us, are cared for in adequate and life-affirming ways. I call to mind at this stage several news reports from The Guardian, especially during the months of April and May this year, which describe the risks that Black and people of color medical frontline workers are going through in the US and the UK in dealing with the rising number of COVID-19 infections. Amongst the reasons given for this phenomenon, a striking feature has been the naming of structural racism in housing discrimination, poverty, unequal and discriminatory treatment in the medical systems. Black and people of color medical care workers literally put their lives on the line to provide care for patients of all walks of life impacted by the virus. News images of medical personnel struggling with a dearth of ventilators, medication, protective equipment, and long working shifts have been part of the narrative these past 3 months, whereby many of these medical frontline workers themselves succumbed to the virus and lost their lives. While the US and UK media have focused on this vulnerability of Black and people of color health care workers amidst the political mayhem caused by both these governments in dealing with the pandemic, interestingly, there were no such statistics to be found about medical frontline workers of diverse ethnic groups in German contexts. What has acquired visibility, however, is the critique of the activist organizations in the city of Bremen directed at the refugee holding camp in Lindenstrasse in a Bremen suburb, where about 380 people were living in 200 rooms and sharing facilities without being able to practice social distancing measures and without masks. Recent reports from the start of June state that the measures had been taken about the end of April and the course of May, where COVID-19 tests had been administered and the number of refugees living in close quarters had been reduced. So currently the Lindenstrasse camp has about 160 residents in a building with a capacity for 750 people or thereabouts. One does not need to be an expert in migration or refugee studies to see that there is a discrepancy here in the sense of urgency in care measures by the German government for refugees who came to Germany looking for a place to call home while fleeing their natal home spaces, looking for stability, peace, and a little dignity. What is notable here is the level of effort taken by the activists to push government bodies to implement necessary measures to care for the vulnerable. The publicity generated by organizations like Together We Are Bremen work with a distinctly politicized care ethics, which demands change for those in vulnerable positions. Recognizing the structural inequality generated by modes of entrenched racism, which expresses itself in avoidance tactics and neglect of implementing social distancing measures and treatment options in the refugee camp, Together We Are Bremen and other like-minded activist organizations exercise care by demanding proper care from government bodies. Now, I don't have answers to this. Rather, as I watch and ponder on the care measures implemented or not, I ask myself, what is the nature of care and its accompanying responsibilities in our 21st century world? Signs of the times indeed. What is important here is that the organization produces knowledge about the situation and its injustices by actively procuring information, doing research on the situation, having conversations, preparing this information for dissemination, and documenting this on blogs and open letters, holding demonstrations with social distancing responsibilities, and communicating with refugees themselves, giving them voice. The production of knowledge then is also part of care politics, as Aaron Martin, Natasha Myers, and Anna Viseo observe. Knowing requires caring about what and how one knows. We assert that the politics of knowledge cannot be disarticulated from a politics of care. To disavow care would leave intact binaries that circumscribe realms of legitimate and illegitimate knowledge, and the pervasive bifurcations that prioritize the rational over the sensory and affective dimensions of knowledge. Foregrounding care and its fraught politics is then one way to stay with the trouble and to take situated knowledges seriously. I want to spend some time considering this notion of how care shapes and drives knowledge production. It is against this backdrop that I want to ruminate on a peculiar care politics that made its way around the world in April in the news and on social media during the first wave of the COVID-19 virus. It concerns two French doctors discussing the possibility of testing vaccines against the COVID-19 virus. Dr. Mira says, if I can be provocative, shouldn't this study be done in Africa where there are no masks, no treatment, no intensive care, a bit like it is done in some studies on AIDS or among prostitutes? We try things because we know they, sex workers, are highly exposed and they don't protect themselves. What do you think about that? Professor Locht replies, you are right, by the way. We are currently thinking in parallel about a study in Africa with the same type of approach, with the BCG tuberculosis vaccine and a placebo. I think a call has been issued or will be issued, and I think we are going to consider it. But that doesn't prevent us from thinking in parallel about a study in Europe and Australia. What kind of care is this? And no doubt, this is care of an interesting sort. The two doctors working within a European reference frame that is marked by whiteness, were planning to develop the vaccine for European sufferers for the virus onslaught, while working with modes of stereotypical thinking about Africa as a place of lack. Here, past vaccine testing on the HIV/AIDS virus is cited as authoritative knowledge, while further gendering, racializing, classing, and sexualizing the continent by extension through references to sex workers. And yet, these doctors are no doubt serious in their mission to do their research, to generate knowledge in order to find a vaccine to deal with the COVID-19 virus, all out of a sense of care. However, the provocative language used here, especially by Dr. Mira, demonstrates a lack of care extended to some marked groups of people while exercising a mode of care towards others. The question here is, would it not have been expedient if these doctors had reflected on the effect of their words in a world already distressed, anxious, and polarized with regard to discrepancies in healthcare, access to resources, and the ongoing effects of structural racism? Interestingly, the Director General of the World Health Organization intervenes. Africa cannot and will not be a testing ground for any vaccine. We will follow all the rules to test any vaccine or therapeutics all over the world using exactly the same rule, whether it's in Europe, Africa, or wherever. The hangover from a colonial mentality has to stop. WHO, the World Health Organization, will not allow this to happen. He added that the comments were a disgrace and appalling to hear in the 21st century from scientists. What kind of care might this be? Tedros Ghebreyesus refutes Mira's proposal here, clearly advocating an egalitarian stance regarding vaccine research. His sense of outrage and his critique of the French doctors' framing of their research enterprise as a hangover from a colonial mentality is also a form of care for those who are structurally silenced and rendered without agency. Dr. Mira issued a public apology later, maintaining that his remarks had been misunderstood, while Professor Vogt hastened to elaborate on plans for conducting a study in Africa, in addition to current studies in Europe and Australia, to test the capacity of the BCG vaccine. And Dr. Mira's question referred to what he assumed were the current conditions in Africa, where, unlike several European countries, including France, apparently countries were not on lockdown. In the aftermath of the uproar, Professor Vogt's research lab has released a statement in which they say clinical trials to test the BCG vaccine's efficacy against COVID-19 are underway or about to start in European countries and in Australia. There is currently a discussion around launching a study in Africa, but if it is done, it will be done alongside these other studies. Africa must not be forgotten or excluded from research on COVID-19 because this pandemic is global. This instance gives us pause to ponder on the connection between the COVID-19 moment and the second global sign of the times, the Black Lives Movement, where Black people speak up against unruly white ruminations on how care politics are circumscribed from white perspectives focused on global North Euro-American contexts. While not necessarily reflecting on modes of care for global South spaces, whereby colonial binaries of advanced versus regressive and backward are recast in problematic frames. Here, the narrative of the deserving COVID patient is framed in care politics entrenched in white fragility, thus intrinsically mobilizing seemingly universalist humanist principles, catering to global North situatedness and reference frames, while yet again, dehumanizing global South situatedness. It is against this backdrop that I want to address a couple of examples of how certain kinds of art function as modes of care politics in knowledge production processes and promote action towards justice. To this end, I address how a 21st century care politics might benefit from rethinking in intersectional frames. Returning to Martin Ayers and Visio's observation that knowing requires caring about how and what and how one knows, and that foregrounding care and its fraught politics is then one way to stay with the trouble and take situated knowledge seriously. I want to stay with the trouble and attempt to take a specific situated knowledge seriously in my own discipline of postcolonial Anglophone literatures. And here I would want to focus on modes of care evident in literary texts, texts bearing aesthetic dimensions, texts working as modes of remembering historical moments, as social commentary, texts as cultural productions, as doing certain types of cultural work, producing and elevating to the status of knowledge that which has been rendered devalued, silenced, indeed erased. My point of departure is the Zong incident of 1781, which is held fast in a short two-page legal document entitled Gregson versus Gilbert, 1783. The names indicate the plaintiff and the defendant in the lawsuit of a slave ship owner and the insurance company. Briefly, the Zong tells the historical narrative of the murder of enslaved Africans on board the slave ship Zong en route to Jamaica from the west coast of Africa. The claim was that these enslaved people had fallen ill, and hence they were damaged goods which would not fetch the best prices on the slave markets in the Americas. The rationale here was that the loss of these enslaved at sea would enable the slave ship owners to claim the insurance for their lost and damaged cargo. The narrative of the Zong, as I see it, can be embedded in a narrative of fraught care politics. First, through the bitter irony of the ship's name, which used to be Zorg, which in Dutch means care. And we have the German cognate Zorgen, which means the same thing. The ship was refurbished by its British owners, and the name was erroneously repainted as Zong. The Zong carried African bodies, names, stories, and histories to their watery graves. Indeed, the ship was anything but a space of care, as we might envision care. But perhaps we might provocatively imagine a mode of care in the uncaring emotional rationale of chattel slavery in this situated knowledge, which had contributed to silencing the voices of the murdered enslaved. Toronto's questions acquire new shades. Why has the language of economics seemingly come to replace all forms of political language? Now, notably, while Toronto appears to be referring to our present 21st century context, even more applicable during COVID-19 times, it is imperative that we recognize that the language of economics had already entrenched its dehumanizing and objectified gaze on people situated at the intersections of race, class, and gender in the institution of chattel slavery, where the enslaved person who was ill was an economic liability and not a suffering human being deserving of care and compassion. Here, I would say Marlene Nobiza Phillips's 2008 book-length poem, Zong, would give us pause to consider the situated knowledges of the enslaved on the Zong, who had been silenced by economic rationales. The recalling of the Zong incident demonstrates a politics of care connected to the politics of knowledge. Indeed, Nobiza Phillip alludes to a haunting in the text signified by the ship's name Zong, which she reads as cognate to another form of utterance. Song. Shout, she says, and ululation. Zong is moan, mutter, howl, and shriek. Zong is song, and song is what kept the soul of the African intact when they wanted water, sustenance, preservation. Zong is the song of the untold story. It cannot be told, yet must be told, but only through its untelling. Here, Nobiza Phillips's text imagines the enslaved singing from beyond their watery graves, drawing breath to create art out of the ghostly half-life that is slavery of death, to record resistance to the silencing, to the reclaiming of their humanity. Nobiza Phillips, the artist, the poet herself, works from a place of care. She notes that the legal text about the Zong incident is the one public marker of those Africans on board the Zong, locating it in a specific time and place, a textual monument to small histories that ended tragically. Zong might have carried song, breath, words, living rhythm, incoherent as they are, trying to make meaning of the atrocity. The poem then is a haunting, a means to tell a story that, though untellable, still needs to be told. And I think this telling or not telling has bearing on our times today. There is much more to be said about Nobiza Phillips's song, Zong, but I would like to move on to how care politics is mobilized by my next literary text as a work of artful remembering and care. I turn to Fred Daguiar's Feeding the Ghosts from 1997. Feeding the Ghosts breathes textual life into the story of an enslaved woman on board the slave carrier Zong in 1781. Feeding the Ghosts is a novel wrought through Daguia's politics of care, that is intent on revisiting that heinous crime that was sanctioned by the colonial dehumanization and objectification of enslaved people who were thrown overboard by the captain and the crew of the Zong. In this multi-perspectival novel, the novelist gives voice and memory and story to one of the enslaved, a young 18-year-old woman named Minta, the heroine of his text. She resists dehumanization. She does not sing, but she shouts. She shrieks her defiance. She refuses to be silenced. She refuses to be thrown overboard. Ouma Narayan's reading of care discourse clearly delineates how care discourse is fraught here with power relations invested in maintaining the privilege of those in power to the detriment of those considered other, wanting, and inferior. To be a slave, a colonized other, an untouchable, a woman has often meant as having one's entire existence defined in terms of one's proper place with respect to those with power, which entailed obligations to acquiesce to relationships of domination. The relationalities of power discussed by Narayan here bear an intersectional framing with regard to race, gender, citizenship, or rather the lack thereof, where the notion of care takes on abusive dimensions. Minta's story of speaking truth to power as a young slave woman mobilizes her positionality as one that was never meant to speak in the first place. Rather, as a Black woman, her frame of action was meant to contain the caregiving function. She speaks for the enslaved being thrown overboard. Indeed, when she herself is thrown overboard, she refuses to succumb to the sea. She manages to pull herself up back on the ship and returns to haunt, especially the first mate of the Zong, a man named Kelsal, who she had met before at a colonial fort on the west coast of Africa. Here, Minta first encounters Kelsal as a patient at the mission hospital where she worked. Lost in delirium, he had forgotten his own name. At the fort, I had to teach Kelsal his name after his fever. He repeated it when I said it. His hand came up to my face and covered the left side. Then I knew he had learned his name. Kelsal, he was saying to himself as I left the room. He was seeing himself and in his name and loving it. Here we see Minta doing care work, nursing Kelsal back to health, back to himself. As an African woman subject to the colonizer's gendered and race hierarchical frame, Minta nevertheless mobilizes a politics of care that builds on humane relational frames that enable the fragmented, traumatized man, white man, to recover his sense of self. This history gives her the courage and will to engage with Kelsal as a man, as the first mate on the slave ship Zong, insisting on their previous intimacy of care by calling his name in full view and hearing of his fellow shipmates and the enslaved. In negating Kelsal's white heteropatriarchal masculine authority as a colonial representative, Minta is bent on performing another, more radical mode of care work, intended to save the lives of the enslaved from being thrown overboard. Notably, this resistance causes a crisis in Kelsal. For a moment, he saw not Minta, but the girl who had nursed him at the fort. Yet he had kept it intact in his mind and her with it. Rather than carrying it around inside him, it seemed as if he were conveyed by it, hung on the skeleton of it, so that the girl who had nursed him there somehow cohabited with him in his bones. Minta was his past. The fort had taken the place of the sea in his body. Minta had returned into his life like a recurring fever. With Minta on board, the Zong had become the fort. He had done what he had done to her because he wanted to be Kelsal again, not the Kelsal she summoned when she called his name, but first mate Kelsal of the Zong. When Minta calls Kelsal's name on board the ship to stop him from throwing enslaved people overboard, she establishes a mode of intimacy with this white man and claims their personal history of a care relationship. Kelsal is aware of this shared history and is shaken in his sense of self as a colonial agent. Minta's presence and her resistance enslave him in turn. He needs to break free of this intimacy which is saturated with Minta's humanity and his own. He cannot bear the care that was shown him by an enslaved African woman, which allowed him to take up his position as first mate Kelso on the zone. Thus, the colonial agenda itself was shot through with a fraught care politics. So while aspects of care discourse have the potential virtue of calling attention to vulnerabilities that mark relationships between differently situated persons, care discourse also runs the risk of being used to ideological ends where these differences are defined in self-serving ways by the dominant and the powerful. So Ouma Narayan points out that the care politics informed by the relationalities between the colonizer and the colonized call attention to vulnerabilities where the care discourse can be used to further ideological ends where these differences are defined in self-serving ways by those who carry power. Zong, song, singing, breathing. The COVID-19 virus affects the respiratory tract adversely, requiring intensive care and special treatment. The virus thus literally takes people's breaths away. It renders them speechless, insensate, unconscious in their intensive care beds, their breathing done for them by a machine, a ventilator. This brings me to another moment of care demonstrated by the current Black Lives Matter movement. To commemorate George Floyd's murder, murals by Black artists in the US as well all across the globe were painted. These works of art on walls in public spaces inscribe this African-American man into city landscapes, reminding us of the dehumanization that has transcended time and space, allowing for a white police officer to kneel on a Black man's neck, while his brother officers did nothing, and the world watched in horror. I read this art of remembrance of a man who became globally visible in the last moments of his life, while people pulled down other public artworks, statues of stone commemorating colonial agents, white supremacists who had dehumanized Black people in the system of chattel slavery. Here then we might see a clear language of care politics that has elected to forego the language of an economic rationale. What kinds of caring are taking place here? What kinds of knowledge are concomitant with this caring? Here in Germany, looking at the video of George Floyd's murder stretching over 8 minutes, 46 seconds of agony and having the breath choked out of him, we remember another Black man, Uri Jalloh, who died while in police custody in Dessau, in a Dessau holding cell in January 2005. George Floyd's death in the US has acquired new urgency in the context of Black lives in Germany, where a politics of care is evident in uncovering the structural racism and the roots of police brutality. And here I ask, who cares enough to do this work? 10 years after the death of Uri Jalloh, a refugee from Sierra Leone, American playwright Amy Evans produced the play The Most Unsatisfied Town, depicting a community of refugees in a small East German town in the early 2000s. Her author's note reads, in the early hours of January 7, 2005, Uri Jalloh, a man seeking asylum from Sierra Leone, was apprehended by German police authorities in the small East German town of Dessau. He underwent a pat-down search and a blood test and was then shackled by his hands and feet to the floor of a cell furnished with nothing other than a fireproof mattress. Several hours later, a fire broke out in the holding facility. Police authorities neglected to respond to fire alarms in a timely manner, and Uri Jalloh was left to burn to death in his cell. The Most Unsatisfied Town was written to raise audience awareness of the insidious ways in which asylum policy leaves individuals vulnerable to gross human rights violations. The play continues to refute many stereotypical assumptions about refugees held by German society. Indeed, the playwright states that she wrote it to raise audience awareness of the insidious ways in which asylum policy leaves individuals vulnerable to gross human rights violations. The character Rahim is part of a community. His partner, his white German partner, Eva, is expecting his child. He is about to become a father. He dreams of studying at the University of Potsdam. Amidst all of this bare life, Rahim is arrested and held in police custody, where he dies in circumstances similar to Uri Jallo's. What kinds of care take place here in this work of art? This play then might also offer perspectives on the current care politics for refugees in the Bremen-Lindenstraße context and elsewhere during this time of COVID-19. Now, I realize that what I have offered here may not necessarily have furnished a narrative of continuity and coherence. My intention was to try to map ways to bridge the concepts of care politics, knowledge production processes that involve works of art and the modes of cultural work that they might do. In the process, I was curious to see if care ethics, as theorized by Hankivsky, Narayan, as well as Martin Myers and Vesio, might be helpful in theorizing around social locations, differences, experiences of inequality and power. In my attempt to bring care ethics into dialogues with intersectionality through a couple of factual narratives as well as modes of artistic expression engendered by these, I hope nevertheless to have expressed some of my own care politics as an educator and researcher of color in literary and cultural studies to contribute to the conversations around these pressing moments that we are living in today. I thank you for listening. Be safe, be well.